Batman's rogues gallery has become quite legendary, and certainly the one who has most tried to use his intellect against the Dark Knight is the Riddler. With his love of riddles, many of his schemes have often involved putting Batman into some kind of puzzle that he has to get out of, which, being the world's greatest detective, he very often does. Also known by his real name, Edward Nygma, the character was introduced in the comics in 1948. It was created by Bill Finger. Dick Sprang then drew the Riddler with his now iconic green costume full of question marks and a purple mask. In his first appearance, the Riddler put Batman and Robin into a series of puzzles that they would have to solve. He appears to get a thrill out of making up puzzles and riddles and see if they can beat them. Surprisingly, only made a few early appearances in the comic books and would not show up again until an issue in 1965. I wonder why more stories were not conceived for the Riddler, especially with the possible storylines that could have been used. However, following his reintroduction, and especially his usage in the Batman television show, the Riddler will make several more appearances in the comics. Sometimes he works solo to beat Batman and Robin, and in other stories he teamed up with fellow villains like the Joker. His usual methods would often involve leaving riddles and clues for the Caped Crusader to solve, which he would often do at surprising speed. Whether on the television series or in the comics, Batman and Robin did not take long to figure out the puzzle and immediately cracked what the Riddler was up to. A lot of his tricks also involved deathly traps for the heroes to attempt to claw their way out of. Depending on the writer and artist and the tone of the story, he could be silly or threatening. But more often than not, Batman would outsmart him, often to the Riddler's chagrin. In addition to the comics, the Riddler's also made an impression in movies and television shows. His first on-screen incarnation was on the aforementioned Batman show from the 60s, where he was originally played by Frank Gorshin. Gorshin brought a lot of energy to the role and showed just how much he delights in coming up with riddles for Batman and Robin to solve. He was even the villain in the first episode in a storyline inspired by his 1965 reintroduction. In the episode, he tricks Batman into falsely accusing him so he can file a lawsuit against him. There was a wacky sensibility to the 60s show that gave it a certain amount of charm, and this episode is a prime example of that. Gorshin would receive an Emmy nomination for his performance, and the Riddler became one of the most popular villains on the show, even joining forces with other villains in the theatrical movie released between the first and second seasons. However, because of a salary dispute, Gorshin did not appear in the second season. An episode intended for the Riddler was rewritten to be about a different villain named the Puzzler, who was originally a Superman villain in the comics. And when the Riddler was used, he was played by John Astin. Eventually, Gorshin reached an agreement with the producers and returned to play the Riddler again for the third season. Over the next few decades, the Riddler would also be used in several DC Comics animated series, voiced by the likes of Ted Knight and Michael Bell. In Batman the Animated Series, he was voiced by John Glover and given a new origin story. In this show, he's a video game developer who keeps having his game ideas taken from him by his corporate boss and not allowed to receive any royalties. He's eventually fired and then years later returns to exact his revenge. He creates a life-size real version of the game, which Batman and Robin then find themselves in. The series did a great job of showing the Riddler's smarts and intellect, although co-creator Eric Randomski admitted he was not all that fond of the character, and writer Paul Dini said he was the most difficult villain to write due to his riddles needing to be complex. As a result, several attempted scripts were never used, and he was only the main villain in 3 episodes, while making minor appearances in others. Interestingly enough, Frank Gorshin's version of the Riddler was an influence on the Joker in the animated series, as Mark Hamill was a huge fan of his performance and utilized a similar laugh. The Riddler was made one of the central villains in Batman Forever, and one of the actors seriously considered for the role was Robin Williams. He was apparently quite eager to do it, as he was a longtime Batman fan, and I can certainly see it. John Malkovich was also seen as a possibility, and Joel Schumacher would later reveal that Michael Jackson expressed interest. In the end, Jim Carrey was cast as the Riddler, with the character being depicted as an inventor with an obsession over Bruce Wayne. Edward Nygma desperately seeks his approval, but when Bruce turns down his invention because of its potential dangers, he creates a whole new identity as the Riddler, and then partners with Two-Face to bring his television device to the masses. Carrey, unsurprisingly, brings an over-the-top energy to the role, which is fitting for the character, and is certainly a lot of fun. He's quite a diabolical character, and his scheme to steal people's personal information through the use of his invention has certainly gotten more relevant with time. I do think the pair with Two-Face would have been a lot stronger if someone had told Tommy Lee Jones to take down several notches. Two-Face should have been the straight man to contrast the Riddler's more wild antics. Instead, we have Jones trying to compete with Carrey to see who can chew the most scenery. Nonetheless, the Riddler does prove to be a worthy foe, even using his invention to discover Batman's secret identity, and then using that to test him in the big climax. It's also great to see Bruce use his own intellects against him in that final confrontation. Oddly enough, despite Christopher Nolan's movies being known for that puzzle-like nature, the Riddler never appeared in his Batman movies, although there was a fan theory that Coleman Reese, a Wayne Enterprises employee, was the Riddler. He has red hair, uses his intellect to deduce that Bruce Wayne is Batman, and Lucius Fox calls him Mr. Reese, which sure sounds a lot like the word mysteries. I can buy into this theory. The Riddler would become a major character on the television series Gotham, which gives him yet another origin. In the show, Edward Nygma initially works for the Gotham City Police Department in forensics. As played by Corey Michael Smith, he's already shown to have a love for riddles and telling them to Jim Gordon. Eventually, he lets his darker impulses take hold and turns to a life of crime. He would frequently team up with Oswald Cobblepot, aka the Penguin, although they also had a penchant for bickering. Over the course of the series, he gets more involved with the criminal underworld, and we see him eventually don his iconic costume with the green suit and bowler hat. Smith brought the needed amount of twisted glee to the role, and owing to the darker nature of the show, the Riddler certainly went some ruthless places as he went up against Gordon and others who opposed him. For Matt Reeves' film The Batman, we got a different sort of Riddler. Owing to the movie's David Fincher influence, he's depicted like a modern-day Zodiac killer as he gains a following through his online activity. He's also given an entirely new costume that hides his face, and his motive comes from a dislike for Gotham's upper class, including Bruce Wayne. This version taps into how someone with an internet following could potentially influence them to do their bidding, and the Riddler is absolutely the kind of villain who would use modern technology and a wide audience reach to his advantage. When he's eventually caught, the interrogation scene between him and Batman becomes one of the highlights of the movie. Paul Dano is able to depict his admiration for Batman and the fear he inflicts on others, and then his immediate disappointment when he gets rejected by the Dark Knight. With his serial killer approach, this is definitely one of the most violent Riddlers we have seen. Checking back in on the animated Riddlers, several more actors have voiced the role in various productions over the past 20 years, including Robert Englund, John Michael Higgins, Rob Paulsen, Jim Rash, Dave Franco, and Wally Wingard. Weird Al Yankovic even voiced the Riddler in a very funny short where Batman keeps answering his riddles one right after the other, and Conan O'Brien voiced him in the Lego Batman movie, although he disappointingly only said a few lines. I could absolutely imagine O'Brien playing the Riddler in live action, though. The Riddler played a prominent role in the animated film Batman Hush, based on the comic book by Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee. He was voiced by Jeffrey Arend and is a possible suspect in Batman's quest to find out who a mysterious villain named Hush is. This adaptation did apparently alter a number of things from the original comic storyline, but where they take the Riddler here is still intriguing. The Riddler has certainly become one of the most memorable villains Batman has gone up against, one very focused on using his intellect to get the job done, and while he could probably achieve more of his activities if he was not constantly leaving clues everywhere, the character would not be nearly as fun without those twisty riddles. See you next time.